most elections are decided in the primary.
When that candidate comes back for re-election, we want to see what you accomplish for our cause. That's why I think partisan primaries are so important.
We have good people trapped in a very bad system that otherwise disproportionately benefits the fringes. And we can't expect different results unless and until we change the rules of that system.
Hey, it's Julie, and this is Top of Mind, where we tackle tough topics with nuance and an open mind. We're out to become better citizens, kinder neighbors, and more effective advocates. Have you complained about something your senator or member of Congress has done recently? I mean, it's kind of our main bipartisan pastime in America, so I'm sure you probably have. But I hope you're also leaning into the political process right now because it's primary election season. Millions of us have or will soon decide whether to let our members of Congress serve another term. I know November is still months away, but in more than 80% of congressional races, the winners are being decided right now in districts so heavily weighted toward one party that whoever wins that party's primary will sail to victory in the general election. And yet, judging from the fact that primary turnout is typically half what we see in the general, American voters are largely unaware just how much primary elections matter.
My light bulb moment was running for office.
This is Nick Troiano, Executive Director of Unite America, which is trying to change the way primary elections work.
Back in 2013, there was a government shutdown that happened over healthcare.
Republicans were trying to repeal Obamacare.
Yeah, correct.
Okay.
And they knew they didn't really have a shot at doing it. It was kind of political performance theater. And being a Republican at the time, I said, this doesn't kind of represent me. I've described myself as fiscally conservative and socially liberal with ideas about how to bridge partisan divides. That made me persona non grata basically in both political parties. And so I became, like now close to a majority of Americans, a political independent. And at 24 years old, I decided to run for office and challenge my congressman in the next election because otherwise he would have faced no competition. And for someone who contributed to this shutdown, who wasn't modeling good leadership in Washington and solving problems, I just wanted to do what I could as a citizen to hold him accountable.
He was a Republican.
That's correct. And I come from a district in Pennsylvania that was gerrymandered to benefit one party over the other, that had closed primaries, so independents couldn't vote.
Was there a Democrat who was challenging, even on the ballot?
There was a Democrat on the ballot.
Okay.
The primary was in the spring, and that's when Republicans renominated the incumbent. Democrats put up a sort of long shot candidate, I would say. And then I got on the ballot by the fall by collecting enough signatures. And, by the fall, it was 3 of us on a debate stage. And that was the payoff for me, actually, was the ability to share a platform to hold my congressman accountable in a way that I just don't think he would have, otherwise. And to give people a chance not just to vote against who they don't like, but to vote for something that they might like. And ultimately, we got 13% of the vote, which was more than any other independent candidate received in more than 2 decades running against both major parties. And so when I was running through this system, I realized the problem here is not my congressman. What we have is not a politician's problem. We have an incentives problem. Insofar as to get elected and reelected, our politicians are incentivized to pander to the base of their party and to the ideological fringes of their party. Not only is primary turnout low, the primary elections are dominated by special interest groups and single issue groups that know primaries are a cheap date. If they want to spend some money to influence a small group of voters to elect a candidate that's more in line with these ideological and special interest PACs, that's how the primaries are influenced today because they are so unrepresentative of the voters. I left that race feeling that we have good people trapped in a very bad system that otherwise disproportionately benefits the fringes. And we can't expect different results unless and until we change the rules of that system.
The change that Troiano and his organization, Unite America, want to see happen nationwide is what 3 states do right now. Those are Alaska, California, and Washington. They hold one primary election with one ballot, and every candidate is on it, regardless of their party. Every registered voter can participate. And the top vote getters from that common ballot move on to the general election, which sometimes means the choice in the general election is between 2 Republicans or 2 Democrats, instead of one from each party like most of us are used to. So that system is called a nonpartisan, all-candidate primary. Now, the rest of America, 47 states, hold partisan primaries with a separate ballot for each party, Democrats, Republicans, Green, Libertarian, whatever you have in your state. And voters have to choose just one primary to participate in. If you've heard mention of open and closed primaries, those are still partisan primaries, so they're separated into Democrat or Republican primary elections. The difference is just whether or not you have to be a registered member of that party in order to vote in its primary. So if you're like Troiano and 45% of American voters who identify as independent, which is a record high as of 2025, by the way, a nonpartisan, all-candidate primary that doesn't make you register with a party is appealing. But if you're in the other half of Americans who still identify, even strongly, as Republican or Democrat, why would you want somebody who's not a member of your party deciding who represents your party in the general election? And what if that all-candidate, all-party primary ballot includes somebody flashy with lots of name recognition and money, but they have no actual governing experience? And as a result, your party's most experienced candidate doesn't even make it through to the November ballot. Now, I think it's important for journalists to be transparent about their own bias. It's really important. So let me tell you mine. I lean more conservative than liberal, but I don't identify strongly with either major party. It's not uncommon for me to vote for Democrats and Republicans on the same general election ballot. But I am in a heavily Republican district where the congressional election is decided in the primary. And you have to be a registered Republican to vote in that primary, so I am. And to be clear, I resonate with a lot of the local Republican Party's platform. But if I had my way, I probably wouldn't be registered with either party. And it frankly kind of annoys me that I'm compelled to pick one just so I can vote in the election where the main decision is happening. Now, I know my worldview is not the only way to see things, so let me just say that whether you're like me or not, this episode today is about trying to see more clearly why primary elections matter, why many people feel they don't work well, and what's gained or lost when they change. First, a quick primer on how we got here.
Well, we've only had primaries since about the turn of the 20th century.
So this is Rob Boatwright. He's a political science professor at Clark University and author of several books on the history of primary elections. He says that before the 1900s in America, we only had general elections.
Political parties met in conventions and they chose their nominees. Voters had no say.
What prompted the change then?
So it was a reform that was championed by a lot of people connected to the progressive movement. These types of party choices were widely perceived as being corrupt, that party nominations could be bought for the right sum or if you knew the right people, and that parties often chose people who were not qualified or were not appealing to the full electorate. So primaries were an innovation that first came about in Wisconsin was the first state to develop a statewide primary.
In 1904.
But they were adopted fairly rapidly throughout the country over the next 20 years.
And widely seen as a positive step for democracy, says Boatwright. Voters liked having a say. And party leaders were not as upset as you might expect about giving up that power.
For one thing, because parties still had a tremendous role in determining who made it to the ballot. And in many circumstances, parties could put all their resources behind one primary candidate. And the other important thing is that sometimes parties don't want to make a choice because they're always going to make some parts of the party really, really angry. So parties, I think, at the time realized that they didn't have to make this decision. They didn't have to have people angry at the party elites unless they really felt like it was important for them to put a finger on the scale to choose the candidate they wanted. So because of that, I think parties went along with the direct primary.
But this shift to holding primary elections also created a conflict, because political parties are private organizations, while elections are a government function. So now we had government officials with taxpayer dollars verifying the party affiliation of voters, printing ballots, and counting results in elections where private political organizations were making the rules. Boatwright says this tension especially flared up in the segregated South.
The Democratic Party would hold primaries and not allow African Americans to vote. So, which is why since the 1940s, the federal government has treated primaries sort of like national elections, but they still give the parties substantial latitude in determining who gets access to the ballot, whether members of the opposing party can vote, whether you need to be registered in the party in advance to vote, those sorts of things.
Okay, so civil rights laws prohibit political parties from restricting their primaries based on race or gender, but parties are fine to ban independents or members of another political party. The Supreme Court has actually upheld that several times based on the right that political parties have to freedom of association. And that is how today nearly every state in the country holds partisan primaries, where each party gets their own. And in roughly half of them, the parties make voter participation contingent on your political affiliation. The other version, the nonpartisan, all candidates on the same ballot primary, is the rare exception. Like I said, only 3 states, Alaska, California, and Washington, do congressional primaries that way. And all 3 of them, by the way, got those systems through ballot initiatives pushed by activists and approved by voters. Interestingly, a wave of similar initiatives actually swept across the country in 2024. They landed on the ballot in 6 states: Arizona, Colorado, Idaho, Nevada, Montana, and South Dakota. But all 6 of those initiatives failed. And in Louisiana, which had been doing nonpartisan, common ballot congressional elections for decades, reversed course, and starting this year will hold separate party primaries. Which is great news to this guy.
I'm Charlie Buckles, currently serve as deputy chairman of the Louisiana Republican Party. For probably 2 decades, I've been on the front lines of supporting closed primaries in Louisiana.
Buckles has also held a number of state Republican Party positions in Louisiana. He's been a delegate to 5 Republican national conventions and twice represented Louisiana in the Electoral College. As we talk, Buckles and I, on video chat, there is a photo on the wall that he keeps pointing to, it's just behind him, of a younger Donald Trump, the businessman, shaking hands with then-President Ronald Reagan.
When that picture was taken, who would have thought? It's just an interesting snippet of time where you had 2 incredible leaders that were in that environment, and who knew what was going to take place over that period of time. I consider myself a very conservative Republican. I believe in smaller government, limited government, individual liberty. So do I support what the president's doing? Absolutely. Did I support Ronald Reagan? Absolutely. So that is my political philosophy.
Okay, so the deal with Louisiana is this. The state used to have partisan primary elections like pretty much the rest of the country. But in 1975, a Democratic governor in Louisiana lobbied to switch to a nonpartisan, everybody on the same ballot primary system. He hoped it would give his party, Democrats, an advantage, since this was a time when there was a lot of flux between the parties over the civil rights movement, and Republicans were gaining ground in the Deep South. So ever since that switch in the mid-70s, with just a few exceptions we won't get into today, Louisiana has held nonpartisan, common ballot primary elections for statewide and congressional races. The primary typically happens in mid-October, and then if no candidate wins a majority of the vote outright, there's a runoff a month later, which is sometimes called the, quote, general election. Now, Charlie Buckles says the consequences of shifting to the nonpartisan common ballot back in the 70s have been disastrous, both for democracy and accountability. He says candidates don't campaign on clear political philosophies, like what role the government should play or how much it should tax.
It's generally on, this other guy over here, he is a real rat. And it's a personality-driven situation. Many people are confused as to really what their stances are. And then when people are elected to office, there's no standard to hold them to.
Can you think, is there an example of someone who got elected where you think that if they'd had to go through a party primary, they wouldn't have gotten elected?
Am I glad you asked that question? We have a very recent example of that, and that's our former governor, John Bel Edwards.
It was 2019, and Democrat John Bel Edwards had served one term as governor, and he was running for re-election. But Edwards was a very conservative Democrat by national standards, pro-gun rights, anti-abortion. And Louisiana's nonpartisan primary system was an advantage to him because he could really lean into his moderate positions as a selling point, rather than first trying to win a primary election against a liberal candidate who might have appealed more to the Democratic base. Meanwhile, on the other side of the aisle,
the two major Republican candidates, Dr. Ralph Abraham and Eddie Rispone, a great Republican businessman from Baton Rouge, the party chose not to endorse either candidate. We said, okay, let's let both candidates run. Hopefully they won't beat up on each other. Well, guess what happened? They went after each other tooth and nail. Not so much after the Democrat, but after them as Republican. Now, don't get me wrong, that can happen. Had we had a Republican primary, that could have happened as well.
It would have. That's exactly how a primary works.
It is, okay. But there's a big difference in the way we do it here, in that primary election was about 30 days prior to the general election. So many candidates beat up on each other. We only had 30 days, basically, for the Republican Party, the Republican voters, to coalesce. And you understand, we had just come off a bloody, bloody race. A lot of one of the candidates' voters just stayed home. Well, because one candidate had been trashing another versus another one. So there wasn't enough time to bring that back together to coalesce.
And John Bel Edwards, the moderate Democrat incumbent, won re-election by about 2.5%. But with Louisiana's new partisan primary elections, Charlie Buckles says the timing will work out much better for both major parties.
Those primaries are held 5 or 6 months ahead of the general election. Then the candidate coming out of that is going to have 4, 5, 6 months that they can bring in support nationally. That the RNC could come in, or in Democrats, the DNC could come in and help them. Candidates can have their people get back together. Now, some of them still won't. I get that. But it makes for, again, back to the basis of, okay, now we have a Republican candidate and a Democrat candidate. So we have a clear differentiation between the philosophies of governing of these two candidates. But not only that, whichever one ultimately wins the general election, once they go into office, let's say, I'll use it both ways, a Republican takes office and governs just like a Democrat. When that candidate comes back for re-election, they're going to have to first answer to the Republicans that put them there. I can see, you did exactly what you said you were going to do when you ran on, or at least you held you did not compromise your beliefs on this. Here's what I had to do to accomplish this.
And there's a mechanism for the party to hold them accountable because you can always primary them.
That's exactly right.
You can always say, we don't think you were conservative enough. We can run a more conservative candidate that's going to challenge you.
That's exactly right. And that's what partisan primaries do. Now, if I elect somebody that I know is going to get up there, and all they're going to do is throw hand grenades and politically, you understand, all they're doing is grandstanding. They've got to come back to the same Republicans or the same Democrats, okay? And say, and
you think the party would hold them accountable?
Oh, absolutely. Because we want to see what you accomplish for our cause. I think that is vitally important.
Are there districts in Louisiana where the race will be effectively decided in the partisan primary?
Mm-hmm. The reason for that, unfortunately, is because the way the districts I'll just use it, perhaps gerrymandered one way or the other.
You think that districts should not be drawn in a way that favors one party or the other?
Absolutely. I believe it should be, because you have communities of interest. I believe that those districts should be as compact as possible, because the self-interest of the people in one part of a state, now we're certainly geographically a smaller state than others, but even within Louisiana, we have divergent really cultures and things like that within the state. And, there may be more Republicans, more Democrats. There may be way more of one than the other. I'll use New Orleans as an example. In that area, there's certainly far more Democrats than there are Republicans. Although what we're finding in this state is that the largest increase in any registration is actually no party.
Right. When I looked at the most recent numbers from the Secretary of State, there's about 1 million registered Republicans, about 1 million registered Democrats, about 800,000 registered no party, right? So if almost a third of Louisianans don't feel like either party represents them correctly, enough for them to want to affiliate, one of the arguments for opening up primaries to be nonpartisan is in order to make sure that unaffiliated, no-party individuals have a chance to weigh in at the level that matters most.
Well, wait a minute. At the level that matters most.
The primary election level.
Well, I would argue with you that the level that matters most is the general election. That's when the people are the official is actually elected. Closed primaries doesn't differentiate, doesn't take anybody away from voting. They still have their vote. It just means if they're not affiliated with that particular party, they'll not have a say-so as to who goes to the general election. Now, any of these people still can switch parties and vote. You know what? I'm a no party, but I see somebody in this Republican primary that I really would like to vote for. So I'm going to switch my...
Does that bother you?
No,
that
not
Democrats
at all.
or no party folks would actually switch over and try to vote in the Republican primary?
I have zero problem with that. In fact, I would welcome that, because I would like the opportunity to be able to communicate with them even better and explain why I believe what I believe, and have some open dialogue on that. Absolutely no concern of that whatsoever. What I do have a concern about, though, is an open system that says, okay, we're going to give you a Republican nominee and a Democrat nominee. But you know what? It may be the Democrats that elect the Republican nominee to the general election. To me, that makes no sense. That's why I think partisan primaries are so important. It does not disenfranchise anybody. If you believe this is who you need to have as your representative, just register with that party and go vote for them. That's what we are as a nation. We're opinionated. We are partisan. These people that say, well, I don't ever believe in anything strong. I just want to go down the middle and whatever. You know what? You have the right to do that. And just like I tell a lot of my good Democrat friends, you have the right to be wrong, and I'll support that.
Charlie Buckles is deputy chairman of the Louisiana Republican Party and a longtime advocate of Louisiana's new partisan primary elections for U.S. House and Senate seats. Now, technically, the system is considered semi-open because unaffiliated voters can participate in a party's primaries without registering with that party, but they do have to just pick one. If those independents were required to actually register with the party first, that would be considered a truly closed partisan primary. Also, because of a bunch of wrangling when this new system passed the Louisiana state legislature, it doesn't apply to state races like legislature or governor. Those elections will still use the older, nonpartisan, all-candidate ballot system, which, says Buckles, tells you something.
It could be, I don't know, but I suspect that they would just not like to have themselves held accountable to their own party's voters, because they may not have had a voting record that mirrored the philosophies of either the Republican or Democrat voters.
with all due respect to Charlie, I just think we have to remember that elections are here to serve the voters. They're not here to serve the parties. Government is here to serve the voters, not to serve the political parties.
Okay, so it's time to hear that counter-argument. We'll be right back. This is Top of Mind from the BYU Radio Podcast Network. I'm Julie Rose. Our days can feel small. We check boxes, stare at screens, and rush from one thing to the next. But I want to share a podcast that opens our eyes to a world that is anything but ordinary. Constant Wonder is your weekly reminder to rediscover how astonishing this planet truly is, from exploring the mind of a bee, to learning empathy from a chicken, to hearing how loss led someone to a spiritual awakening. Marcus Smith, the host of Constant Wonder, invites you to spend an hour with natural wonders or with remarkable people who are wonders themselves. Find Constant Wonder on the BYU Radio app or listen on Spotify, YouTube, or Apple Podcasts.
Despite the fact that close to half of Americans identify as independents, there are 0 independents in the House of Representatives today. That's unrepresentative of where the majority of people are.
So this is Nick Troiano again, who ran as an independent against his Republican congressman in Pennsylvania back when he was 24 and lost. And now he heads the nonprofit Unite America, trying to abolish party primaries, which is why I was surprised to hear this come out of his mouth when we spoke.
The invention of the party primary was a step forward for democracy.
After all, says Troiano, primary elections actually gave voters some say, as opposed to just the party elites making backroom deals. And Troiano says having the 2 major political parties hold their own primaries worked pretty well for a long while.
The primary started to become a problem when the parties themselves really began to polarize. If you go back maybe 50 years, we actually had 4 parties in our 2-party system. You had liberal and conservative Republicans and liberal and conservative Democrats that were geographically different. There was a New England Republican at that time. There was a Southern Democrat at that time. And when the parties began to polarize as a sort of post-civil rights era, that polarization overlaid with a primary system that then made the primaries not just a nomination contest, but kind of an ideological purity contest, such that by the time that we get to the early 2000s, you had an incumbent senator like Arlen Specter, who was a moderate Republican, get run out of the Republican Party and ran for re-election as a Democrat and lost. You had a Democrat like a Joe Lieberman actually get primaried and lose his primary. Interestingly, he went on to run in the general election as an independent and get reelected. But those were the early sort of primary contests that showed something was off here in terms of leaders who were more in the political center rather than the extremes starting to get primaried by not towing the party line. And now fast forward to where we're at 20 years later, which is members of Congress living in fear of being primaried if they don't follow party leadership or adhere to the party dogma.
And how does that affect the way they govern, do you think?
Let's look at immigration, for example. About a decade ago, there was a bipartisan bill in Congress for comprehensive immigration reform, dealing with both border security, economic reforms, a path to legal status for those who were brought here as children illegally. That got over 60 votes in the Senate. It went to the House. But that summer, Eric Cantor, the House Majority Leader Republican, was primaried out of office for being open to some of these ideas. And it sent a signal to every other Republican. We can't deal on this bipartisan issue, otherwise we might be next. That problem reversed itself by 2018 when a Democratic leader, Joe Crowley, was primaried out of office by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez running on an immigration platform of abolish ICE, which was a more strident take from the left on the issue. And so within a few years, we went from a bipartisan bill in the Senate to this very partisan debate over build the wall or abolish ICE, the parties not being able to address it. And then here we are today, pendulum politics of a period of time in which we had basically an open border policy, and now a period of time in which there are masked agents doing deportations in American cities. That's the result of a political system that does not work when the incentives are misaligned and when our leaders can't get together to actually solve a problem.
Well, it sounds like then what you really are hoping for is to kind of, some might say, try to water down the party, which many party loyalists would say is not productive. Like, we need the differences. We don't want, stop trying to make us all one big lukewarm middle.
Yeah, I would say I reject the premise there. I think the best elections that represent what this movement is about is what a general election ballot looks like in Alaska, when it isn't just a choice between the furthest right Republican and the furthest right or furthest left Democrat. You have 4 candidates on your ballot. So you might get those 2 choices, as you typically might get in a party primary system. But you also might get other candidates with different ideas, and not just centrists in both parties. You might get a libertarian. You might get an independent. You might get someone running on a new issue that you've never heard talked about in the major parties before. So by making our general elections not binary zero-sum contests between both extremes of the parties, but by opening them up to multiple candidates, I actually think we'll get a much more vibrant democracy, more choices for voters, not fewer. And the goal is to elect leaders who ultimately represent the median voter in their district. If that district is a very progressive district, that leader will be quite progressive. If the district is very conservative, that leader will be very conservative. This is not about optimizing for a bunch of moderates. It's about optimizing for leaders who represent their constituents and know that their job is to ultimately deliver results, not just party rhetoric and party squabbling that we see in Washington today.
Isn't that more of a gerrymandering problem, though? Why do you see the partisan primary election as the problem?
Well, the problem is more so in the primary, because even if we got rid of political and partisan gerrymandering, the fact is most districts would still be locked for one party or another because of how we've geographically sorted. Urban areas being more Democratic, rural areas being more Republican. Even if we draw perfectly balanced and contiguous and compact districts, they would likely mostly be safely Democratic or safely Republican, which means in those districts, the party primary would effectively still be the only election that matters. And so by reforming the primaries, what we're really doing is introducing more competition so that November elections are competitive and all voters get to have a meaningful say in who gets elected.
Are there instances, do you think, where the parties can be a positive influence?
Yeah, no, I mean, our 2-party system worked when both parties worked well. Democrats and Republicans got together to enact Social Security and Medicare. They did the Civil Rights Bill. They did welfare reform and a balanced budget, with majorities of Democrats and Republicans in Congress doing those things together. There's nothing inherently bad about political parties when they're focused on trying to represent people and to get things done. Today, that's not the case. And it's because the parties have been weakened under our party primary system, not strengthened. They're weakened because the party primaries have outsourced the tough job of candidate recruitment and endorsement and nomination, not to people who are within the party and leaders and are informed on the issues, but to the party activists and the special interest groups that try to influence them. We're the only democracy in the world today where there's a direct election for party nominees rather than some kind of process by party leaders to influence that process. And so this is all to say that we have weak parties today because of party primaries. By reforming the primaries, I actually think the parties will wind up nominating more mainstream candidates and will wind up running and winning more elections when they do that.
Why wouldn't we want to just strengthen the parties by eliminating the direct primary?
I think the genie is out of the bottle in terms of the direct primary. I don't think Americans would go for it to go back in time when there are these smoke-filled rooms and party bosses getting to decide. So insofar as where we're at today, rather than the party activists having all the power, why not have a broader electorate involved in the process of, candidate nomination where party primaries exist?
In an open, nonpartisan election, what power do the parties have, if any?
Yeah, under an open all-candidate primary, in which there's a single ballot and the top finishers go to the general election, parties as private organizations can still have their own process to recruit, support, and endorse a candidate. They can do that through their caucus system or through any other system that they would like. In Colorado, where I live, the parties organize their own caucus system where the party members show up and they take a vote and they get to endorse a candidate. The government isn't involved in running or paying for those processes. It's also 2026, and instead of using a caucus system and expecting people to get off work or to stay late into the night to participate, I think the party should consider doing this online. They can use our new technology and tools to make it even more representative. Again, they can do whatever they would like to do. When it comes to election day, as an American citizen and voter, you should be able to vote in every election and for whomever you want.
So Unite America's strategy is to try and get this to happen state by state through ballot initiatives, like the 6 that were on the ballot and failed in 2024, which I did point out to Nick Troiano.
Yes, I mean, it was extraordinary that 6 states did place initiatives on the ballot. That was thousands of citizens signing petitions to do that. And in 3 of those states, those measures came within about 3 percentage points of winning. It was disappointing that they didn't, but there were millions of Americans who voted for these reforms, which are rather new. Most people don't wake up every day thinking about electoral systems and election reforms. And so I'm quite bullish on where this movement is going, because if you even go back a decade, there was no groundswell for changing our primary process. That groundswell is now building, and we're making progress state by state.
I respect the effort to see the silver lining, but I also do need to ask, what happened? What are the primary barriers holding this back then, given that you thought you had a lot of momentum and then it came up short?
Well, I think both parties are reflexively opposed to any changes that could, in their view, undermine their power. And so right now we're facing opposition from the sort of party establishment on both sides. I ultimately think the people will prevail, but we have to overcome the kind of organized opposition that we're seeing today.
Nick Troiano is executive director of Unite America, and he's author of The Primary Solution: Rescuing Our Democracy from the Fringes. So there's one other little wrinkle I want to throw in here that we haven't touched on yet, but it's used by dozens of cities and counties for local elections, as well as state and federal races in Maine and Alaska.
With implementing ranked choice voting, even though my first choice didn't win, my third choice did, so I felt my vote still mattered.
Just to head on top of mind how ranked choice voting actually works. And then we'll hear an idea that could address a lot of the concerns people have about primaries without actually requiring us to change the mechanics of the election. I'm Julie Rose. This is Top of Mind from the BYU Radio Podcast Network. We'll be right back. Hey, it's Julie. If you're like me, sometimes you just need to add a fresh voice to your podcast listening habits, and I've got the perfect solution. It's The Lisa Show from BYU Radio. It's an award-winning, nationally acclaimed podcast that tackles the everyday struggles we all face: parenting, mental health, relationships, social issues. Lisa Valentine Clark is the host. She is a widowed mother of 5, and she knows firsthand how messy life can be. So through honest conversation, hard-won wisdom, and a good dose of laughter, she reminds us that we're not alone. So take a good look at life, as she likes to say, and tune into The Lisa Show. You can find it on byuradio.org or any of your favorite podcast apps. Doug Goodman is an independent voter who has been all across the political spectrum. He was a Democrat in his youth, Republican in middle age, independent since 2010, which he says was one of the hardest decisions he's ever made.
And the reason I say it was probably one of the most difficult decisions is I knew what I was voluntarily giving up, because Nevada is a closed primary state. And I was voluntarily giving up my right to participate in the most important election. Most elections are decided in the primary. And I said, I just can't accept it. So what can I do to change it?
He started Nevadans for Election Reform and has spent the last decade advocating for a change that landed on the Nevada ballot in 2024, but failed by 6 percentage points. It would have created nonpartisan, all-candidate primaries, like we've already talked about, but with an added wrinkle that the top 5 candidates in the primary would advance to the general election.
Then you use ranked choice voting in the general election, where you rank 1, 2, 3.
So I, as a voter, I go into the ballot. I have these 3 candidates.
Yeah.
And what's my action item when I'm in the
Okay,
polling
which
location?
candidate is your favorite? Which candidate do you prefer? You don't have to ask yourself, I really like this candidate, but they don't win, they can't win, so am I, voting for the other guy? No, you can vote your favorite candidate. Okay, who do I like next? Second choice. Who do I like third? Third choice. Just like you make choices you make every single day on everything.
And what's the advantage of that?
Okay, what happens is right now, in most general elections, you have a winner with well under 50%. You have a winner a lot of times with 30%.
Right, whichever one can get the most.
Right, so you
but
may have...
It's often not more than half of the electorate.
Right. So let's say somebody wins with 30%, that means 70% didn't like this person, voted for somebody else. And with implementing ranked choice voting, it looks at, okay, let's look at first choice votes. It's like a normal vote. Does anybody have a majority? 50% plus one. Yes. Election over. Done. No. Then it looks, okay, which candidate has the fewest first choice votes? Okay, it looks at that candidate and says, bye, you're done. It says, okay, if that was your first choice candidate, now who did you vote for second choice? And your vote is now reassigned to that candidate. And it looks, okay, it is a candidate that had 50% plus one. Yes, really good.
Oh, so as a voter whose first choice was maybe the least likely to win, but they're the candidate I liked the most, right? As a voter, I don't have to feel like I wasted my vote because I knew they were going to lose anyway, because now you're going to count my second choice. So I still have some say in the outcome.
Exactly. And in fact, the best quote about this situation, in 2008, voters in Santa Fe, New Mexico, approved using ranked choice voting in their city elections. Because of court challenges, it wasn't implemented until 2018. After the first election in 2018, Bill Richardson, former state governor, former UN ambassador, who was a Santa Fe resident, he was quoted as saying, I didn't quite understand what ranked choice voting was, but it was well explained. And even though my first choice didn't win, my third choice did, so I felt my vote still mattered. So now you have a winner with, I like to say, a stronger level of support. You hear a lot of arguments say, oh, this violates one person, one vote. No. Your vote you still only get one vote. It's reassigned to candidates. But that's why it's important, too, for you to rank all candidates. So, and this has been, there are court cases that uphold this. So, again, it's,
So talk to me about what was the campaigning like? What kinds of interactions were you having with people when you were trying to encourage the voters of Nevada to say yes on this ballot initiative?
It was explaining where we were and then explaining the advantages. How often do you go to the polls and hold your nose? How often do you say, I really like this candidate, but, how about you've got most of the voters in Nevada cut out of the process? How do you feel about that? Do you feel government is working for you? And, that was one way. And then, explain this to me. So that was easy part on the open primaries to explain that piece. And, the ranked choice piece is, okay, how often do you make decisions every day? Oh, yeah, okay, I do. Hey, do you go to a restaurant and you want to order something? The waiter says, oh, we're out of that. You find it difficult, saying, oh, this is too difficult of a process to understand. Minorities won't understand this.
The ranked choice voting, that was one of the arguments. Like, this is too complicated, it'll disenfranchise voters, especially
the Democratic Party. They actually said it was too complicated for, underrepresented folks to understand. They're not going to understand it. Our voting system is too complicated.
Well, straightforward as it seems to Doug Goodman, there's clearly a learning curve to ranked choice voting. It takes research to be ready to do more than just pick your favorite candidate on the ballot. Lots of people actually just leave their second and third choices blank, which undermines the benefits of the system. And, this is important, we're all so keen to jump to conclusions about the winner the minute the polls close and results start coming in on election night that ranked choice voting can be confusing to people. Going through the process of assigning second or third choice votes in order to get a majority winner takes time, and it can sometimes make a strong frontrunner in that first tally fall behind in the second round. So there's an education process to this. And in Nevada, the concerns ultimately defeated the ballot initiative, which leaves Alaska as the only state in the country currently holding nonpartisan primary elections that also uses ranked choice voting in its statewide general elections. And ever since that became the case in 2022, there have been constant efforts to repeal it. But if the whole goal with ranked choice voting and nonpartisan primaries more broadly is to make sure that more people's votes impact the ultimate outcome of an election, couldn't we accomplish the same thing if we just really boosted primary election turnout so that it's more on par with general elections? I asked Nick Troiano this, and he said, well, yeah.
There are two ways of solving the primary problem. One is to convince millions of people to vote in an election in which they're currently not voting. The other way is to change the rules to shift competition from the primary to the general election so that the decision of consequence is made when millions of people are already deciding to vote. I'd much rather make a rules change that meets most voters where they're at than try to change voting behavior for millions of Americans, which I just don't think is a realistic solution.
But Rob Boatwright, who is the primary election expert at Clark University, thinks there's one change that would actually drive a lot more people to show up for the primaries, regardless of how open, closed, or partisan they are. He says, let's have a national primary election day, just like we all know that the general election is always the second Tuesday of November.
A lot of the problems with primaries happen because they are sequential. So Texas, for instance, they're going to have their primaries the first week of March. We're going to have primaries spread all throughout the summer. The last primaries happen in September in New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Delaware. If primaries were all held on the same day, I think they would get a lot more media attention. So you're there in Utah, maybe you don't have an exciting primary, but over in Colorado or somewhere else nearby, there is an exciting primary, and you kind of hear about this, right, from regional media sources and so on. So I think turnout would go up substantially. I think it could be treated as sort of a civic holiday and so on. It could be treated as something for Americans to celebrate. That would push up turnout a lot.
And Boatwright says the narratives that arise around primary elections would change, which would also be good for turnout.
You take, for instance, in 2014, when Eric Cantor, the House Majority Leader, lost his primary. That was one primary out of 400-some primaries, but it was interpreted by the media as this message about this sort of ascendant right-wing movement, and it really shaped how Americans thought about that election. If Cantor's primary had been on the same day as all of the other Republican primaries, it wouldn't have affected all those other primaries, right? They all would have been treated independently, and we would have been able to look at the primaries and say, okay, this is what happened, right? This is the story of this year's primaries. So having primaries on the same day, I think, would eliminate the role of the media and the role of partisan interest groups in trying to selectively use primaries to tell a story about their particular kind of agenda. So there are all sorts of obstacles to making this happen. But we have a history in the United States of states banding together to create primaries that work for them. If you go back to the creation of Super Tuesday, for instance, in the presidential primary, the story there was southern states wanted to drive up turnout to gather attention. So if states were to do this for their state primaries as well, or if there was some sort of national advocacy movement to try to get states to all consolidate their primaries, even if not everybody did it, right? If some states moved in that direction, I think it would increase turnout to the level that it would make primary voters more representative of the electorate.
Congress couldn't come in and mandate it in any way, or?
There are some people who argue that Congress could do this, or that they could premise the provision of political funds, right? To have your primary.
Yeah.
You can incentivize states. The national parties could incentivize states to do this. So there are ways to encourage it. You could also take lessons from the National Popular Vote Compact. This is about the Electoral College, right? States many states have made this pledge that if enough of them agree to give their electoral votes to the popular vote winner at the national level, they would all effectively go along with this. You could have states create some sort of compact about their primary date too, right? Once 20 states agree to do this, we will all move it. And again, it doesn't have to be everybody, but if the more that states consolidate their primaries, the more of an effect there will be on turnout, even if not everybody does it. So states could try to work with each other to do it as well.
That's Rob Boatwright, political scientist and primary election expert at Clark University in Massachusetts. He's author of Reform and Retrenchment, A Century of Efforts to Fix Primary Elections. Do you know how your state's primary elections work, or when the deadline is to get your registration in order if you plan to vote in a party primary? Definitely go and do that now and mark your calendar for that date. Because while there are lots of avenues for reform that we've heard about today, the personal responsibility piece really stands out to me. Election results are more representative when more voters do the research and make the time to show up. I've actually been thinking about this for quite a while now and trying to make my own election participation as impactful as I can within my state system, which is closed and partisan, as I mentioned before. Back in 2024, I went a step further and became a poll worker for my county elections office. Now, partly it was curiosity, because we hear so much debate about the risk of fraud and the general trustworthiness of our elections. I really just wanted to see for myself how the process works, which turns out is something you can do in every city without even being a poll worker. You can call up your county elections office and ask for a tour. Talk to the clerk directly. Go on election night and watch the workers tallying votes. You can even attend an audit of election results. I have gained a whole new appreciation for the safeguards that are in place to secure our elections after spending these last 2 cycles working a polling location on Election Day. And when it comes to primaries, I gotta say the trickle of turnout that comes through compared to the flood of voters who come for the general election in November is pretty stark. Well, I hope you learned something today. I did. And I hope you have a plan to participate in a primary election. Let me know your thoughts. Email topofmind@byu.edu or find us on social media. We are Top of Mind Pod on Instagram and Facebook. And I'm going to put a couple of links in today's show notes for other Top of Mind episodes we've done about elections. One is about how money influences elections in America, and the other is about what it would really take to build more public confidence in our elections. I think you'll be interested. Top of Mind is a BYU radio podcast. Today's episode was produced by Alex Larson, Abby Karras, Samuel Benson, and me with help from Sam Payne. Our sound designers are Hayden Thompson and James Call. I'm Julie Rose. We'll talk soon.